Я хотела бы представить нашего первого докладчика Бренду Yeoh из Национального университета Сингапура, которая представит нашему вниманию доклад «Пути к космополитизму. Миграция талантов, среда брака в городе-государстве Сингапур».
Good afternoon. I'm Brenda Yeoh, and I sort of figured out that I was introduced. And again, my apologies that I don't speak a word of Russian, and I don't think Chinese helps us as well. Chinese, so I just speak English. And this is my work. I think many speakers have mentioned that this is my very first time here. So it's. No, sir. Okay, right. So is that better? Right. Okay. So and it's been a fascinating time, both in terms of the temperature difference between Singapore and Moscow. I come from the tropics on the equator, actually. I mean, 30 degrees above zero, and so it's a 50-degree temperature difference. So it's been really exciting. I will have to. The talk today is focused on Singapore, and I will try to slow down a little bit because I'm not sure that people realize where Singapore is. Most people still think it's part of China, so I should have brought a map, but let's see how we go. This course I would like to engage with to start off is the whole what Alphanets have already been talking about in terms of cosmopolitanism, and in terms of the existing literature on cosmopolitanism, I mean, there's still a tendency for it to be conceived of in rather abstract terms, and there's still a lack in terms of empirical case studies, sense making. And this particular talk is to try to do that with the example of Singapore as a city-state that is basically a cosmopolitan city wannabe. So the need here is to pay attention to different actors in the way that they articulate cosmopolitanism, and as well as the kinds of practices of articulation themselves. And I hope to show in this particular talk that there are multiple versions of cosmopolitanism, and not just a cosmopolitanism that's associated with the elite, sort of the Western metropolis or the corporate or business elites, but that we could think of cosmopolitanism and how it extends sideways, not just upwards. And part of the talk will also focus on some of the contested processes that underlie the multiple articulation of cosmopolitanism with different actors. I basically tried to put lots of words on the slides because I thought it would be easier for cross-cultural communication when, if you don't understand me, then at least you could read what's up there. So the aim of this particular paper is to focus on the different actors and practices involved in the contested processes of making distinct versions of cosmopolitanism as articulated in the city-state of Singapore, and as they relate to different migration flows. And here I'll be talking about talent migration, labor migration, and marriage migration. And I'll try to look at the roles of the state and civil society actors in the way that they collaborate and conflict over different approaches to coping with difference in the city-state of Singapore. So very, very short history. This is really very short. Looking at Singapore, basically, it has an ancient past, but it's sort of founded by British colonialism as a trading emporium in the 19th century. So, it's often associated with a very variegated kind of demography, culture, and landscape. Partly because the British had a liberal open-door policy on immigration, and the style of British colonialism was pragmatic kind of tolerance for plural societies. So, and I'll just illustrate that by just looking at one map of Singapore in the early 19th century under Raffles, the so-called founder of modern Singapore. And he basically planned Singapore in terms of ethnic kampongs or ethnic precincts. So, for example, you can't quite see, but Chinatown is on the south of the Singapore River. The Malay kampong is on the North River. European town would be in a different area here where there's a town square and so forth. So the idea being that it was very much a divide and rule kind of principle to try to cope with the multiple, with a plural society in Singapore. So that's basically lasted through colonial times. And by the time we get to independence, Singapore became independent in 1965, the nation state was newly founded, and there was the challenge of trying to build a nation state out of the plural fragments of colonial society. And the emphasis here in the nation-building philosophy is to emphasize economic nationalism, as well as the welding together of the heterogeneous groups into so-called one people on the basis of what's been called the 4Ms plus M. And what does that mean? Basically, against a backdrop of a plural society with racialized categories that are quite hardened by colonial policy, the new national leaders had little choice but to think of a way of welding the people together on the basis of this 4Ms plus M, which is a kind of multiracialism often known as separate but equal multiracialism. The 4Ms refers to multiracialism, multiculturalism, multilingualism, and multireligiosity. The separate fifth M is meritocracy as a way of governing or rulemaking amongst the different groups. The groups are designated as official races, and in Singapore we have Chinese, the majority race, Malays, a substantial minority, Indians, also a substantial minority, and a category called others. So this is known as a CMIO model of multiracialism, where the four official groups are seen to be separate but equal. There's encouragement of coexistence of different religious practices, customs, and so forth without discrimination for any particular community. And you would see in all the various iconic photographs that are produced during this time would be, for example, you'll see the Singapore flag, and beneath it would be 4 children, each one representing one race, Chinese, Malay, Indian, and other child, lined up in a very orderly fashion, again to symbolize the 4 separate but equal races. Meritocracy is, in a sense, meant to be that glue that will ensure that no one race is favored over another, but of course meritocracy could also function as a means of disempowering groups because it erases the grounds upon which racial groups could make claims on their own behalf. So again, that's really a very short history of the foundations of the nation state and the multiracial ideology that Singapore was built upon. I'll now have to quickly turn to the last couple of decades, basically, where the multiracial philosophy has been faced with a number of different challenges as a result of very rapid immigration. So by the turn of the 21st century, one of the issues has to do with declining fertility rates among the citizen population, and that is in some ways compensated for by very aggressive immigration policies and the declining citizen fertility rate plus the very high immigration rate has led to a much higher degree of diversity than can be coped with within the CMIO model. So if you a very quick look at the rapid fertility decline, well, as the newspaper says, I mean, the stock hasn't been doing its job, the population isn't replacing itself. So from a relatively high fertility rate in the 60s, just after independence, fertility has declined very rapidly to well below replacement. So the current fertility rate is, in 2009 it was 1.22, and I've just checked the more recent one, it's gone even further now to 1.11, I think. So, so the line you should be looking at would be the blue line. That's the total fertility decline. The other lines represent the different races, and what we can see there is that the green line, the line that's the highest fertility, that's the Malay population that traditionally had more children, and kept the fertility rate up. But even amongst the Malay population, fertility rate has come right down and is now below replacement. The little blips and sort of troughs and peaks represent sort of the year of, for example, the year of the dragon, according to Chinese zodiac signs. This year, for example, is the year of the water dragon. So, and the dragon is seen to be auspicious year, so people are hoping that fertility rate would go up. Whereas if it's the year of the tiger or the year of the goat, then it's not good to produce. In the year of the tiger, for example, tiger girls are supposed to be not very marriageable. So some issues there. So there is the cultural complication as well, but the idea here is that fertility rate has been dropping very rapidly. I won't go through this particular chart, which shows the growth rate. But if you just focus perhaps on the last line, last row, in terms of the citizen population that's growing at an annual rate of 1%, the permanent residents are growing at a rate of 6.5%, and the non-residents, which would be largely migrant workers, that's growing at an astounding 19%. So if you compare the demography of post-independent Singapore, in the 1970s, 5 years after independence, we had a population of 2 million people, overwhelming majority of citizens, 90%, and very small percentages of permanent residents and non-residents. Whereas, few decades down the road, in 2009, the total population is almost 5 million, and only under 2/3 are citizens. So a whole 1/3 of the population would be foreign, either migrant workers or permanent residents. So the whole, this particular talk is to try to think about how Singapore's current project of trying to become cosmopolitan is built upon this kind of demographic and immigration background. And much of the current project of becoming a cosmopolis, this is a term that the state uses, is again very much state-led. There are many projects which I won't have time to go into in terms of state-imposed projects to purposefully cosmopolize the city and its people, and to invent a new sort of cosmopolitan city. So, but it then has to struggle against the kinds of racialized ideologies and policies that were so central to both colonial and the immediate post-colonial period. So just to put it in a nutshell, this whole idea of Singapore becoming a cosmopolis is articulated by many of the political leaders. This is one by the former Minister Mentor Lee Kuan Yew, the founding father of Singapore. It says that to succeed, Singapore must be a cosmopolitan center to attract, retain, absorb talent from all over the world. We cannot keep the big companies out of the local league. Whether we like it or not, we're entering the region and we have to have a globalized economy, etc., and sort of attracting talent in business, academia, performing arts. That's the way to vibrancy and securing our place in the global network of cities of excellence. So let me now focus on the 3 types of migration. Firstly, talent migration. This is seen to be the key plank in re-engineering Singapore to compete effectively in a globalized knowledge-based economy. So the quest for talent is something that seems to be absolutely crucial. And again, in the words of Lee Kuan Yew, this represents the final contest for nations in their struggle to stay ahead in the 21st century. So, again, many different kinds of speeches which I won't go into, but this idea that we should welcome the infusion of knowledge and foreign talent will bring, that we must become a cosmopolitan global city, an open society where people from many lands can feel at home. And this is just one of the very famous Chinese actresses, Gong Li, who has now become a Singapore citizen, so she's leading the way to sort of attracting talent, in this case, artistic talent. This one is interesting. This is from the Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong in a National Day rally speech, where he talks about today we get people from all over the world. We have people from Turkey, they are Portuguese, somebody from Venezuela, somebody from Morocco, even a Korean or two, some Russians. And they add color and diversity to the society. So our cuisine is something special. Singapore love food. You want Korean ginseng chicken, you can get a real thing cooked by a Korean. You want Arab food, you can go to Arab street, you can eat shawarma, which is shish kebab, and you can smoke the hubble bubble, the water pipe. That's kind of difficult because, in Singapore there are no smoking rules, so we have to think of something to do with that. And the jewel in the crown here is this splendid wedding in Singapore where the groom came riding on a white horse. He was a Maori, it's an Indian group, Indian businessman, very successful cast. So the zoo, the Singapore Zoo, is now thinking of going to service by providing horses and elephants for weddings. So this is a sense of the kind of society that the political masters would like to invent for the nation state. So there are a whole slew of different measures, which I won't have time to go into, to promote integration between immigrants and citizens, millions of dollars spent on this. But remember, this is to do with people who have talent. So you have no talent, then this doesn't apply to you, as you will see in a while. So this is talent-driven cosmopolitanization of Singapore, which has in many ways gentrified many of the neighborhoods in Singapore. They are now nationality-based enclaves in private residential and condominium belts. And it has created a lot of concern among Singaporeans. The degree of resentment, for example, was very much felt in our last elections last year, where the PAP, which is the main political group, lost quite a number of seats as a result of different kinds of concerns, including this fear of foreign talent taking away jobs, being paid too much, enjoying all the privileges of living in Singapore with none of the responsibilities that citizenship must bear. Singapore males, for example, have to serve national service 2 years in the military, and that's a source of contention. Okay, but it's truly transformed Singapore in many ways in terms of boosting property prices, rental yields, and gentrifying much of Singapore for a diverse, globe-trotting crowd and to serve cosmopolitan clientele. So I think I have to rush here, but so in other words, talent-driven cosmopolitanization of Singapore is very much state-driven. It is linked to economic imperatives of creating Singapore as a talent capital of the global economy. It is a strategy that extends upwards, not sideways, as it places a premium on certain elitist forms of diversity and not others. So as this particular photograph shows, both riding the train of globalization, foreign professionals are given a first-class welcome, whereas foreign construction workers on the right may not be treated in the same way. So I'm going to go on now to labor migration and looking at the foreign construction workers and so forth. Okay, Singapore is very labor short, so we have always been reliant on imported foreign labor, and with economic restructuring towards service, finance, high-tech sectors, this has become increasingly an issue. And in Singapore, labor migration, that's to say not talent migration, but labor migration of the unskilled or the semi-skilled, is highly managed. There's a work permit system, there's a dependency ratio, there's a levy, and essentially, to cut a long story short, labor migrants are admitted into the city-state on short-term work permits as disposable labor without any residency rights. So basically, they come on work contracts for like 2 years and are treated as transient labor, and they are expected to rotate out of the system within a few years. But of course, in terms of numbers, they are keenly felt in the everyday landscape in terms of weekend enclaves. As you would see in pictures like this is Little India in Singapore. Most of the people in the photographs are foreign construction workers from India or Bangladesh. So they are new immigrants, not the older sort of Indian population that's part of the citizenry. So these are largely transient workers who have come to Singapore to work for a couple of years. Same with Filipino domestic workers. We also have large numbers of Filipino and Indonesian domestic workers who are admitted, again, on short-term work contracts. In this case, along our major shopping thoroughfare, Orchard Road. Of course, you could say no sitting, no picnicking, but who cares, right? I mean, yeah. So what's interesting is the absence of labor migrants from state-driven cosmopolitan discourses. These low-skilled, low-paid migrant workers seem to have no foothold at all in the whole discourse of making Singapore a cosmopolis. Instead, much of the discourse is largely negative, focusing on the fact that they are a public nuisance, and the state is also complicit in constructing foreign workers as outsiders with no residency rights. So again, the Singaporean unease with large numbers of migrant workers, asking for more security measures, relocating them elsewhere, and so forth, basically speaks of a kind of spatial politics of exclusion that is in some ways reminiscent, unfortunately, of a sort of colonial mentality in the past where Asians were also treated as outsiders in their own land. What I would like to stress, though, to be a bit more optimistic about the situation, is that I do think that there are alternative cosmopolitan visions emerging, not from the state, but from Singapore's fledgling civil society. I have to stress the word fledgling because this is in the context of a very strong state and a rather weak civil society. But what has in some ways hardened me quite a lot is that in recent years, the rights and welfare of migrant workers, these large numbers of construction workers, domestic workers, have been, in my mind, one of the leading edges in progressive development within the civil society landscape. And it's kind of interesting that it is the plight of migrant workers that have become a key turning point for civil society, largely because there was several cases of just growing sense of dismay and outrage, starting with women's movements, largely to do with the abuse of domestic workers, foreign domestic workers in Singapore. Some of them were very badly abused. A couple were died, because of the abuse, and that basically galvanized Singapore society and especially the women's groups to action. And since then, and this is several years ago, there's been the growth of a broad range of NGOs focusing on migrant labor, including service-oriented groups as well as advocacy groups trying to advocate for better rights for foreign workers. And in their discourse, there is, well, in terms of services, there's of course the usual ambulance services to address the plight of the disadvantaged, but also human rights kind of campaigns for a Sunday off in employment contracts and so forth. Many of the domestic workers, for example, don't have a day off in the contract, so that's been something that civil society has been trying to fight. And in this particular battle, many of the groups are drawn on international human rights discourses, which is interesting because in Singapore there is an allergy to discourses to do with human rights, but also drawing on other ideologies like, that we should have a cultural welcome and to make Singapore a home for all. So using some of these kinds of ideological discourses, some more acceptable to the state than others, to press the point that migrant workers should be treated as part of Singapore society. So to summarize that, so whilst the state has systematically focused on migrant labor as an economic resource, basically as disposable labor, civil society groups in recent years have been very active in humanizing migrant worker issues and rendering these issues more visible. Of course, we have to contend with the strength of state hegemony and a rather depoliticized culture amongst the citizens. So much of this development is incipient, but I would say that it's at least heartening to see some of these, the growth of cosmopolitan ideals in relation to migrant workers. So through the looking glass of civil society, cosmopolitan ideals, which extend sideways to include not just the foreign talent that the state valorizes, but also the large numbers of less skilled migrant workers can perhaps be glimpsed. And if you want to be optimistic, about this. But my last set of migration issues I want to talk about is marriage migration. And again, this is something that has grown tremendously in Singapore, and in terms of cross-nationality marriages. That is to say, a citizen spouse marrying a foreign spouse. It is now about 40% of all marriages. So every year, 40% of Singaporean marriages involves a foreign spouse. This particular picture here is one stream of this kind of international marriage. Largely Singaporean blue-collar worker, male blue-collar workers have not been able to find a Singaporean wife. They think that the Singaporean women are too career-minded, too sort of fussy and so forth. So, and in the hope of securing a docile, subservient, no gentle spouse, wife, basically they've been looking at the region. And in Singapore now, there are marriage agencies that recruit Vietnamese women as brides. In this case, these are 3 young women who have come up to Singapore, and you can travel from Vietnam to Singapore because in 1 month free without visa because we're all part of the ASEAN nations. So, and they are basically wandering around, placing themselves on the shop front here in the hope that a Singaporean man would come and marry one of them. So, so that's, and they have 1 month basically. So if they can secure a husband within the 1 month, then they would have succeeded because the visa lasts for 1 month. So, so this is interesting in some ways, and again, I don't have time to go into the statistics, I think. So on websites and all that, this kind of service. I have to say that there are major issues with this form of marriage migration because the foreign wives, their residency rights are dependent on husbands. They do not receive residency or citizenship rights on marriage. They are seen as dependents of the husbands. So if anything happens to the marriage, they will lose everything and they have to exit the nation state. So that's a major concern for many of them. They are also not allowed to work whilst they are on a social visit pass, and they have to depend on the husbands to apply for residency and citizenship rights for them. So that's been a major issue. I think I've no time to talk about this, but it's the children of the mixed marriages, but I have to skip all that. Yeah. So I think what I wanted to stress is that marriage migration, which is a major form of immigration these days in Singapore, does raise various issues in terms of the status of the women themselves, because they are incorporated into the nation state only via their roles and identities within the family. So they are incorporated in the nation state as a wife, as a mother, as a daughter-in-law, not in their own rights. So that's one issue. So the state policy is one, in my mind, of non-policy. They are seen to be dependents, reliant on husbands, in that particular transient state, they have very few rights. And the contrast here is with in terms of civil society. Civil society, as I've tried to show, has been very active where it comes to migrant workers. But to date, it has paid little attention to immigrant wives. And the reason for that, I think, is to do with the fact that immigrant wives are not seen as labor, so they are seen as within the private sphere of the family, and therefore not something that civil society concerns itself with. Okay, I'm going to draw to a close by just summarizing. First of all, in terms of talent migration is definitely inextricably aligned with the cosmopolitan project of the state and seen to be compatible with the economic and cultural aspirations of the global city. And given its multicultural legacy, I mean, one would think that it would be easy for Singapore to incorporate talent migrants into the city-state, but there are also certain issues to do with social acceptance and integration of the transnational elite into Singapore society. So, in contrast, for labor migrants, this is a very, very large group that's ignored by the state, which has been taken up largely within civil society, where, in my mind, they have provided the leading edge in pushing for a cosmopolitanism that's broad enough to include these large numbers of migrant workers as socio-political subjects with some rights and not just as an economic resource as the state portrays them. So this, of course, is again not unproblematic because of the state's long-standing allergy to human rights discourses. And finally, for marriage migrants elsewhere in Asia, in Korea, for example, has been a significant force in producing, in Korea, which is just 10 years ago, a rather homogeneous country, there's at least this whole rhetoric of multiculturalism and this sort of expectation that it will diversify Korean society. In Singapore, the irony is this. Singapore is already a multicultural society, but the incorporation of marriage migrants haven't been as active a force in creating more progressive development, partly because marriage migrants are basically incorporated based on social problems kind of templates, so they are seen to be like women who are vulnerable and therefore not seen to be part of the more progressive stance towards multiculturalism. So in my mind, this is a missed opportunity. I mean, here of not discerning the possibilities of harnessing cosmopolitan subjectivities for a new generation from hybridized families that would be the outcome of these marriage migrants. Yeah, so I'll stop.
Brenda, thank you so much for your presentation, which is really thought-provoking, and I think that you have risen the issues which are becoming very important here in Russia as well. And I guess that we now opening the floor for discussion and comments. So, sure, вопросы, комментарии.
Well, thank you very much, Brenda. It's extremely interesting society that you're describing, of course. I wonder if you could fill in a little bit about this talent migration, which is obviously treated very generously, and one can see that coming to Singapore under those circumstances would be in fact a wonderful community. But I wonder who are the talent migrants, where do they come from, how many of them actually stay on? Because I'm sure that, you know, coming to Singapore for a while is a wonderful career option for a great many people from different parts of the world. I would suspect that they are not staying, marrying, raising their families in Singapore in the long run. Are there any who do, and where do they come from?
So the state's strategy is, the exhortation is to be race blind when it comes to talent. Anyone with talent, and if there's a need for you, whether it's scientific talent, academic talent, artistic talent, or, to lead the MNCs and business and so forth, there's supposed to be a red carpet welcome. And many sorts of incentives have been given for attracting talent, because the idea here is that Singapore has very few resources, with nothing basically, like one tiny little island. So this is a state rhetoric that if we don't build up a talent pool and become like a talent capital of the new knowledge-based economy, then there's no future for Singapore. Its own population base is seen to be far too small to produce the kind of talent needed for the globalized future. So that's the stance. So in other words, it's really people from everywhere and anywhere. As you could see, includes Russians. And I do have Russians as my colleagues. In Singapore, in the university. But the bulk of them would come from Asia, largely China and India. And that's partly a result of demographics, but also partly a result of the fact that Singapore does position itself as an Asian society where Chinese and Indians may find a certain comfort level. So we do have Western expatriates as well as Asian expatriates, and the various studies have shown that the likelihood for foreign talent, as we call them, to transit to become a permanent resident is actually quite high, but the transition from permanent resident to citizenship would be rather low. As I said, there's also the national service barrier that's negatively seen by many as a step towards citizenship. So the bulk of people who do take up citizenship, the various surveys have shown, tend to be Asian expatriates. So Chinese or Indian immigrants would think of a long-term settlement in Singapore, and their children would then to take up national service, which some of them have embraced. Amongst Western expatriates, the rate of taking up citizenship will be very, very low.
Спасибо. Еще вопросы, комментарии?
So I have a question. In seeing this appeal for talent, I sense the presence of Richard Florida. Has Richard Florida been to Singapore? Is he a hero? And I'm then thinking about the next implication of Richard Florida, which is tolerance is the great asset that attracts the talent. But Singapore has not been notable for its talent. So, for its tolerance. So, and if you're going, of course, toward gays, which are the center of Richard Florida's, you know what I'm talking about. So, is there a stress in that regard, and how does that play out?
Florida is definitely a known name in Singapore. quoted in policy documents and so forth. his index is. So I don't think he's actually been to Singapore, but definitely, his work is known. Is well known in Singapore and cited as well, because part of being a global city, a cosmopolitan city, would be creativity. So there has been a lot of attempts to remake Singapore and to make it more creative. Okay, in some ways this has succeeded in terms of infrastructure. The government has definitely poured in a lot of money into recreating sort of theatres and music halls and all that, which were absent. We were, I would say, very much a cultural desert, say 10 years ago, but Singapore is transformed quite a while. More contentious will be issues to do with a more bohemian culture, which Florida would advocate. That does run into all kinds of ironies and contradictions in terms of policies to do with gays and so forth. So definitely it's more open amongst my colleagues now in academia, and many of the scientists and all that would that's not seen as an issue anymore, and including some leaders who would be openly gay and therefore would not have been acceptable, say, 10, 20 years ago, but that's perfectly fine now. But of course, there are still sort of very strict sort of policies to do with that have not been dismantled as yet. So it's a very contradictory kind of situation. I would say that if you were to summarize, basically infrastructure all there, but whether you can just create buzz and creativity by just infrastructure is a major question.
Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. I see a lot of parallels between the situation you're describing in Singapore and what I observe in Moscow. But it seems that the difference, at least that I can see in Moscow, is that even internally, there is a lot of migration from other parts of Russia. And in many ways, Moscow is a very multicultural city without an ideology of multiculturalism, or without this overt ideology of cosmopolitanism. I'm wondering if you can comment, because you mentioned in the different, with the different kinds of migration, you said within civil society there is some questioning of the policy towards labor migration, but not towards, say, marriage migration. And in terms of this, can you talk a bit about the place within the ideology of cosmopolitanism for other kinds of rights besides, or other kinds of tolerances, if you will, besides just tolerance for different ethnicity, this kind of picture-perfect melting pot image? Do you think that cosmopolitanism connects to issues of tolerance for people of different sexualities, or attention to issues faced by women, for example, within the society? And is there any sense of this, that cosmopolitanism could include these different kinds of tolerances as well, not just foreign or ethnic?
I think you put the finger where it really, at the pulse of Singaporean-style cosmopolitanism. There's a cosmopolitanism that's still very much sewn to the multiracial framework. I mean, Singapore is a highly racialized society, so everybody carries an identity card. You have a race, and that defines a number of things, like what language you learn in school. If you're Chinese, you have to learn Chinese. If you're Malay, you have to learn Malay. A Chinese child cannot learn, even if he or she wants to, an Indian language, for example. So, and there are housing quotas which are built around race to prevent ghettoization. So, cosmopolitanism is a bit of a gloss that is built upon a highly racialized society, and it's racialized from its colonial roots. I mean, that's how society, the society that the political elite inherited from the past was one that's where race is something that's talked about quite a bit. So my sense is that we're still struggling even with that tension between multiracialism, multiculturalism on one hand, and cosmopolitanism. I mean, so the words are used, but the meanings behind the words needs to be interrogated. There is little still that stretches cosmopolitanism to to encompass other kinds of rights, I mean, like gender, sexuality, and all that. I mean, the discourse on that is, I would say, quite silent. So it's very incipient. I mean, but I suppose I want to be optimistic about my own society, hoping that what we see in civil society these days would be a guidepost to the future, where the openness of the discourse in civil society will develop. I mean, so the hope is that in 10 years' time, if I have to give the same talk, I mean, there will be a more expansive sense of what cosmopolitanism means. Right now, it's still very much a cosmopolitanism that's very much tied to economic nationalism and the multicultural framework.
Спасибо. Да, я вообще ожидала, что из Москвы хотя бы кто-то из России задаст вопрос, потому что я думала, что это такой больной вопрос для нас, потому что вот, например, сюда меня привез замечательный узбек, который всю свою жизнь прожил в Таджикистане, сейчас работает в Москве и агитировал меня всю дорогу голосовать за Путина.
Hello, my name is Anna Esparza, and I'm the representative of Moscow State University, so I'm Tolomonos. And I have several questions. As far as I have understood you, marriage migration plays an important role in Singapore, yeah? And you have noted the fact that there are Vietnamese girls who every year come and are so much eager to be married with some Singapore guys in order to improve their conditions of life and so on. So I would like her to maybe define more precisely the figures. As far as I understand, male, yeah, so men are eager to marry and to find a wife from abroad. And what about women? So what's the proportion between men and women in Singapore? And so how many men in Singapore every year, if you have figures, yeah, I see that you have, marry, and why is it so? So can you comment on this fact? This is the first question. And then I have the second question. You have just said that there are some drawbacks as you see them, and there are some things to be improved. And can you say more precisely again, what are these drawbacks as you see them? Because what you have told us just for Russia and for Moscow as well is just paradise. So that is why we are eager maybe to know for what you are longing for and for what you are eager to develop. Okay, thank you so much.
So the first has to do with maybe a little, to take a step back, Singapore, as I mentioned, is facing very rapid fertility decline. And much of this fertility decline that I showed a while ago has to do with the fact that marriages are being delayed and non-marriage, singlehood is on the rise. I mean, this is, I suppose, part of socioeconomic development, the fact that we're an urban society, I mean, and women are, they always women, and the women are highly educated and not needing to get married to have a life, basically. So these trends, which are very much part of urbanized trends, has occurred at such a rapid rate in Singapore. So the singlehood rates are highest amongst these two groups. The blue-collar male workers, so men with low educational levels, will be one group. And the other group amongst the women will be the university-educated women. And the two groups refuse to marry each other. So, again, you say whose fault it is, but you know, I mean, the women in Asian cultures generally do not marry down in terms of socioeconomic status and so forth, and the men are just still thinking that they will find a docile wife somewhere, and the university-educated women are not going to deliver that. So this has led to the blue-collar worker men looking to the region, to the poorer developing countries in the region, Vietnam, Indonesia, sometimes Thailand, Philippines, for brides. And some of this happens through social networks, but in Asia, what's interesting is that some of this occurs through commercial agents. So, you know, as you saw that it's the brokers for marriage have basically seen this as a business of matchmaking the poor Vietnamese rural woman who wants a better life and not highly educated but still richer Singaporean men. So the figures you see there, the blue line would be the men. So obviously, the Singaporean men marrying a foreign spouse is represented by the blue line. That's the majority of it all. So the question is, what's happening to the university-educated women? So that's well, I mean, they go to conferences. Well, I mean, I've interviewed some of these. I mean, there's no need to for marriage. I mean, life is, you know, comfortable as it is. I mean, and some of them are marrying foreigners as well, as you can see from the pink line, but that hasn't really increased dramatically at all. And some would be married sort of Western men with perhaps, I don't know about this one, more liberal ideas as to what women should be, and so forth. So that's the pattern right now. And so in terms of how this is related to, well, cosmopolitanism, I mean, the point which I didn't have time to make also has to do with the children. Because to me, international marriage is a great opportunity of transforming society from within, from inside the family itself. So yes, Vietnamese women who come and marry Singaporean men will probably face a very hard time in Singapore and so forth. But my hope is that this will lead to a force that probably the state will be able to reckon with, which will be children of mixed marriages having this wider sort of cultural empathy for, you know, because they do have many other resources to draw on in terms of their cultures. So very quickly, for example, right now it's very difficult for these children of mixed marriages because the CNIO category doesn't fit them. They're all sort of lumped into this category called others. And as this quote shows, this disgruntled new citizen, a Caucasian man with a Malaysian wife of Indian heritage and 3 children, 2 from a previous marriage to a Chinese woman and 1 from this marriage. He was unable to purchase public housing due to racial quotas, he laments. We don't fit a cookie-cutter definition of race, and to simply categorize us as others overlooks our unique blend of race and culture. So it's still a major problem because of this, the strictures of the CNIO categorization. But I suppose I'm an optimist. My hope is that more of this will mean that the CNIO categories will just have to dissolve, will just have to become more porous, and race will hopefully become less of an issue in the future when if people are just of different kinds. I don't know, that's my hope. Yeah.
I'm afraid we will have to finish on this optimistic note, for Singapore at least.
Don't hold it too close to your mouth, because when you speak, yeah, that's what happens.
Yeah, anyway, we are finishing. Thank you so much, Brenda, for your wonderful talk. And yeah, thank you so much.